And criminal justice. His areas of expertise include sociological theory and ethnic studies. His major publications include The Social Organization of Immigration, Family and Community Life of Italian Americans, and Building Little Italy. His most recent book is entitled Priest, Parish, and People, Saving the Faith in Philadelphia's Little Italy. In that particular book, he explores Philadelphia's Italian immigrant faith community in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Please welcome Dr. Richard Juliani.
Well, Darren just said everything that I want to say, so we might as well go back to the table, get some more food, and we can all go home. If I take a moment to look around the room, just a moment or two, I think I may recognize a few people who attended a previous presentation in 1998 when an earlier book came out, Building Little Italy, Philadelphia's Italians Before Mass Migration. And when I realized, as I made my preparation for today, that I might be seeing some familiar faces who were here on that occasion, I could only think that if I could just write a little faster and finish a book a little sooner, we could have shorter intervals between occasions like this, and that would make me very happy. And I would get to see you more often. But if you look at this book, I hope that you will understand what took me so long. Okay? When that last book was in the final stages of preparation from the publisher, I started writing the new book, and it's been nearly 10 years that I did the writing on that book. It's actually been more like 15 or 20 years that I was fooling with the materials that are behind that book, and I'll explain that in a moment. But I also want to thank the library people here, Joe Lucia and his wonderful staff, for having this kind of program and inviting me to come back again. But particularly because of the title that is used for this series, Scholarship at Villanova, because I feel very honored to speak under that banner. Since the time that I was a graduate student, and that's a long time ago, the word and concept of scholar have held a very important meaning for me. And today I realize just recently that when I send emails to students in my classes, I usually use the salutation, fellow scholars. And I realized that from my early days as a student, it was a very sacred concept to me. So I'm very pleased to be here under that kind of label, scholarship at Villanova. I think it's a wonderful thing for the university that we take that rubric very, very seriously. I also have a very strong belief that the history of a large city such as Philadelphia, in a large city such as Philadelphia, there are far too many people who can pass their entire lives, then die, and be quickly forgotten. And much of my book is about one of them, this man, whose name was Antonio Isolari, who happened quite by accident as I started into this work. I did not know it when I began, but he was born in a town called Villanova d'Albenga, near the large city of Albenga, on the coast of the region of Italy that lies between Genoa, up above Genoa, and the French border, the Riviera del Ponente, as it's called, the western side of the Riviera, the Italian Riviera. I think Isolari was a man that from the late 1960s, when I first started doing research in Philadelphia, I used to hear references to almost fabled life. Oh, Monsignor Isolari, all the time. He had been dead for 30 years, for about 35 years when I first started into that kind of work. But and in the back of my mind, I think, was planting the notion someday I'd like to write a bit about him. And he had a little place in my doctoral dissertation. He has about a half a dozen pages in the first book, Building Little Italy and His Parish, which was the first church founded for Italians as Catholics anywhere in the United States. It's the flagship parish of Italian American Catholicism. Isolari, who was pastor for, get a load of this, 56 years. I asked the guys at the Archdiocesan Archives, can we document whether there ever was another pastor anywhere in American Catholicism who may have had a longer tenure? And they said, no, it's impossible because records are kept very well often. But you could argue that 56 years makes him a good front runner for a distinguished laurel, maybe the longest running pastor. He came in 1870 to Philadelphia. He retired as pastor in 1926. He dies in 1932. Okay? And as I said, we forget him because he was ordinary, just another priest. But I think in this case it's one whom I think deserves to be remembered, and perhaps because at the very same time that he was very ordinary, he was also very extraordinary, as far as I'm concerned. Because the more I got into him, the larger my appreciation became for Father Isolari, Monsignor Isolari. T.S. Eliot, okay, another extraordinary name. The greatest American poet of the 20th century. Once wrote, "A people without history is not redeemed from time, for history is a pattern of timeless moments." I'm going to put that on the back burner because I'm going to come back to it at the end of my talk today. I would like to share with you a little bit about what my work is about in general, all of my work, what this particular book is about, how it came about, and finally, what draws me in to do this kind of work, what my motivation is. I've had some people say strange things to me, like after I spoke to a group of writers in Delaware County a few years ago, and they said, "You must not have much of a social life." Well, my social life this is part of my social life, really. During the past spring and summer, I've been rereading some things that have been around a long time. One is Russell Weigley's edited book, Philadelphia 300-Year History, that was published originally in 1982. It's over 700 pages, and as I reread it this time, I found myself asking, how much space did the contributors to this, I think really the keystone volume on Philadelphia history now it is the fundamental document on Philadelphia history. How much space was given to racial and ethnic diversity in Philadelphia? And when I tried to kind of quantify the sections, count the pages, how much attention was given to it, I was surprised that not a whole lot more was given to it. I thought there was a certain kind of failure there. The irony is, in the epilogue to the book, Edwin Wolfe, the late Edwin Wolfe, who was a well-known historian, amateur historian perhaps, but wrote, "There is no history of a city. There are many histories, each valid in its own way, many localized in time or space, some sectarian by race, creed, or color, and each has its contribution to make to a mainstream." I realized myself a long, long time ago that you really don't tell the story of America as a society without telling the story of each of its peoples. Another book that I was looking at very recently is by a very distinguished scholar at the University of California, Ronald Takaki, whose name may be familiar to some of you, a book called A Different Mirror, A History of Multicultural America first published in 1993, and it is again one of those very bedrock texts for those who deal with racial and ethnic history. It's a very good book. Each chapter deals with a different racial or ethnic group, and as I was reading Takaki's book this past spring and early summer, I saw chapters on African Americans, chapter on American Indians, chapter on the Irish, chapter on Jews, chapter on Chicanos, and I found myself saying, wait a minute, where are we? You know? Let me suggest two basic facts to you. First of all, from 1820, when the U.S. government first began recording data on new arrivals to America, to the year 2000, from 1820 to the year 2000, about 5.5 million Italians were recorded as having immigrated to the United States. In the federal census for the year 2000, nearly 16 million Americans identified themselves either as, in terms of their primary or secondary ancestry, as Italian in their origins, their ancestry. And that kind of factual information provided the beginning and the basis for much of my work renewing that information, but 40 years ago the same kind of information was informing my motivation. Let me say something about the background of this particular book. As I began to think about what kinds of things I wanted to share with an audience about how I came to write this book, it became clearer and clearer to me that when you try to write a book, it tends to take on a life of its own and gets out of control. It becomes a thing with its own heart and soul and its own direction, its own design. The effort seems to take a life of its own and go off in a different direction that you thought it was going to take when you started. And that is exactly what happened in this particular case. The book began with a gift from a man that I remember as Father Christmas, okay? His name was Father Alfred Natali, okay? He was an Augustinian priest that many of his fellow Augustinians out here remember quite well, an elderly man who was assigned to St. Mary Magdalene de Pazzi, that old parish, which is a diocesan parish, but they put this aging Augustinian in there because of his fluency in Italian and because they didn't know where else to put him. And he was a lovely, lovely man. I had the good fortune to make his acquaintance and become very, very comfortable, very friendly with him. There was a certain kind of closeness. I don't think I saw him as often as I should have, but a certain kind of closeness. And one afternoon when we were climbing around in the attic over the main chapel at Mary Magdalene de Pazzi, we were looking for printed publications by Father Isoleri, okay? Father Natalia told me, Isoleri stuff is all up there. We were climbing through the attic, and Father Natali pointed to a musty, ancient, broken down, fragmenting wooden crate, and he said, Richard, those are Monsignor Isoleri's papers. Would you like them? At that point, I went through the ceiling of the building, okay? I took the papers home, and I put them in the trunk of my car and brought them home, kept them under my desk for years. This probably was in the early 1980s, and I think after about maybe 10, 15 years, I would pick them up, start to page through them, try to find stuff, especially when I was working on the earlier book. I was trying to find stuff. 90% of it was written in Italian. Some was written in a rather quaint form of Italian that partly doesn't exist any longer. And it was all written in his script, okay? And after a good, I'd say 10 to 15 years, I discovered I was reading this stuff with more facility than I had at the beginning of the process, and I had subjected my own self to a good bit of personal development as far as the language was concerned. And I started to separate the papers that had secular content from the papers that were purely spiritual. If I was looking at a sermon for Pentecost Sunday in which he tells his congregation how to get to heaven, I wasn't terribly concerned with it. But if the sermon addresses the problems of families in the neighborhood, if it has a secular thrust, I was very interested in it. So I started pulling that stuff out, and I started bringing in the office here and duplicating it, because I wanted to see Isolari not simply as a spiritual leader, but more as a secular communal leader. Wanted to see how he played out the role of the priest as a secular leader and how he served an immigrant community. I tried to count those papers one time. I was curious about how many pages there were, and one afternoon, and the papers begin with his notes as a seminarian in Genoa in the 1860s. And I reached about 8, 9, 10,000, I think, and I looked back at the crate and I thought, I think I'm about 1/3 of the way through, okay? And I thought there's really no need to count the number. I'll just take a stab at it, and if anybody asks me, I will be able to say maybe between 20 to 30,000 pages of material here, okay? Monsignor Isolari was actually the 6th pastor of Mary Magdalene de Pazzi. As I told you, it's the first church founded anywhere for Italians anywhere in the United States. The parish had been founded as the Italian Mission in 1852, and then it was the first 8 years under founding pastor Gaetano Mariani, who was from Tuscany. Isolari is from Liguria. Mariani was Tuscan. 8 rather tranquil years, and then Mariani dies. And then they go through a very turbulent period of about 4 or 5 years with temporary pastors and a lot of friction between laymen struggling to resolve the issue of trusteeship. Who owns the property of the church? When in the colonial era, because of the reservations about the Church of Rome and other religious bodies, the first colonial charter of Pennsylvania does not allow religious bodies to own property. So religious property was put into lay hands. And this is going to resurface in the early 1800s at other parishes, not Italian parishes, but St. Mary's and Holy Trinity. Trinity was a German parish, in which there are rather explosive events leading to the closings of those parishes. And the same thing happens in the 1860s in Philadelphia with Mary Magdalene de Pazzi, because the lay trustees want to assert their control over the parish, and Archbishop Wood was our ordinary at the time, our bishop at the time, native of Cincinnati, Anglo-American, not Irish-American, Anglo-American, British descent, was having friction with it, wanted to assert the control of the Diocese of Philadelphia, not yet Archdiocese, Diocese of Philadelphia, over the property, and the trustees defy him, and he eventually orders the church closed and sacraments suspended under an order of interdict, which it's kind of interesting because somewhere along the line I've read recently that about an old interdict, it may have been in Morris's book on American Catholics, Charles Morris, that after a very early interdict, it was never done again anywhere in American Catholicism. And I thought that's flat out wrong. It was done in Philadelphia in the late 1860s with the church that I've been looking at, okay? Well, Wood is shopping around for a safe candidate as pastor to bring to Philadelphia to reopen this church that had been founded by Bishop Newman in 52, and 53. And he gets the recommendation of this Antonio Isolari, who's a seminarian about to be ordained, or has just been ordained in Genoa. It's kind of interesting because if he had only read Isolari's poetry as a seminarian, he would have known this is not the guy to bring into Philadelphia, because Isolari is writing this very patriotic poetry about the House of Savoy and the New Italy as it struggles for its independence, and much of that struggle is against the Papal States and the armies of the papacy. And this is dynamite to bring a priest in who's writing this kind of poetry, because from the poetry you would have to say, we don't know how long he's going to be a priest. I mean, he may take up a rifle and go off to engage against the armies of the Papal States at any moment. But he's brought here in 1870, and he was being trained. Brignole Sale Seminary in Genoa trained missionary Far Eastern missions, and Isolari originally thinks he's going to China or Korea, and he's writing dramas about the priest martyrs in Korea that the church is celebrating at the moment. I think there were 8 or 9 priests that had been killed together in Korea, and he thought he was heading to Korea or China as a Far Eastern missionary. And he gets assigned to Philadelphia instead, and in part of his writings he talks about, it may have been, in fact, it may have become part of a poem if I'm not mistaken, but he talks about the first time he heard the word Philadelphia, and he knew that his future would be in this American city, and the anticipation. In his poetry, you do get a sense of the personality of the man. You do get a sense of his values and his spirit and his energy. And in any case, he arrives here in early 1870, and by February he is installed as the new pastor at Mary Magdalene de Pazzi, and he's going to be there for the next 56 years. Okay. This massive amount of paper that he left, well, back in the days before email, when we wrote everything down and we made 12 copies of everything, was, as you might imagine, a daunting task for me personally at the beginning. But I thought I saw it becoming more manageable with the passage of time as I read more rapidly and translated more easily more and more of these pages. But what I started out to do was a biography of Isolari, and I thought it was going to be pretty down and dirty kind of thing. Just a simple, straightforward biography of this priest, with a nice, straightforward tale, no problems to it, and so forth. But it started to evolve into, my sociologist self kicked in, and I started to look at the church as an institution and how that institution functioned in facilitating the adjustment of a foreign-born population. What was the role of the church in facilitating all of this? And then it became yet a more complicated study of the relationship of Italians as Catholics, because I began to discover more of the very special problems that they had and the way in which they were defined as a problem, both for the diocese/archdiocese of Philadelphia, and then in their relationship to Catholicism on a more national level as well, Catholicism in America. Of very special importance in what I tried to do is the time period for all of this. Because from the founding of the Italian mission in 1852 and Isolari's arrival 18 years later to the end of his life in 1932, this is a very critical time in the history of Italians as immigrants to the United States. It could not have been a better chosen time. It was a period in which Italians in Philadelphia go from a small handful, clustered in the vicinity of this church, and then become a component of a huge migration from Italy to the United States toward the end of the century, and a very large part of the Catholic population in the city, and then begin to get redistributed into beyond the original location in South Philadelphia to other neighborhoods of the city and to suburban parishes as well. There's one chapter in which I take up the outlying parishes and briefly look at places like Stratford and the suburban parishes that you may be more familiar with. Some of you may be more familiar with. But I think there are 3 basic foci, 3 basic topics, objects, targets of the book, and they are expressed by the subtitle, Priest, Parish, and People. And I want to spend most of my remarks today just summarizing a little bit, a paragraph or so on each of these things, what they represent, each of these things. Let me talk about priest first. It is, as I started out to make it be, the life of Father Isola from 1870 when he arrives, brought here to save the mission that is closed under interdict. We're going to reopen the Italian parish of Mary Magdalene de Pazzi. And incidentally, there's an interlude during that period of closing where in the Catholic press it is being referred to as the Parish of the Immaculate Conception and referred to as the French Church in Philadelphia, which just blew my mind when I saw this kind of thing. But it evidently was serving other ethnic populations. And something that I like to rub in with some of my Italian-American confreres, this is the church that we celebrate as the first Italian parish in the United States. It would not have survived were it not for Irish benefactors who were members of the parish and doing the very extravagant thing of taking year-long pew rents as pew holders, rented for the year. And they were a bit more affluent than their Italian neighbors. And Isoleri, on public occasions, is a great flatterer of his Irish congregants. He always salutes the Irish members of his parish and has a very happy relationship. He does not have a happy relationship with fellow Irish-American priests in all cases, but the Irish-American families that were part of his parish, he always expressed his great gratitude toward, and always acknowledged that his struggling congregation probably would not have survived were it not for their participation in the church. And it's kind of funny at times when you see some of the events that they are celebrating when they're having a banquet, and the prize that's being raffled off is a painting of an Irish patriot, a portrait of an Irish patriot. And you have to kind of remind yourself of the context of this parish and ask yourself just what's going on here. When you read his remarks given on the occasion of that celebration, it gets a little bit confusing as you try to sort it out. In any case, Isoleri was not simply a spiritual leader with influence in church matters and religious matters, but an important figure for the secular immigrant community. And in some sense, I'd like to characterize him as the chaplain of Little Italy for a long, long time. For a long, long time, he's going to be pretty much the only priest serving the Italian population, because he, through the 1870s and 1880s, in his correspondence, in those pages that I talk about, they are sermons, they're letters, they're personal documents written to himself, like diary-like documents. It's a wide assortment of papers. But you get, often enough, you get statements from Isoleri in which it's obvious that he's been pleading with the bishop to send him an assistant, and that he cannot manage. He's getting part-time assistants. People are coming from the Vincentian Seminary in Germantown, for example, who are Italian priests to serve at the parish on a temporary basis. But he really needs a resident assistant. He needs some assistant pastors, some curates that'll come in and help him out. He's not going to get that kind of help until I think it's perhaps the mid-1880s. So he's there for about 15 years, and he's overwhelmed with work. But not just spiritual work, but he is intervening in some ways with the secular affairs of the community. For example, there's a great scandal brewing over the slave children who are musicians playing in the streets, who are being exploited by their masters, the word that is used. And there's a great campaign to save these Italian children from this kind of exploitation. And Isoleri is one of the people who gets involved in that kind of thing. But I think more broadly, through his leadership, what is happening is he is facilitating the adjustment of these Italian members of his congregation to their new setting, leading them to find a place in America, while he is also helping them to retain their old identity as Italians. When the First World War breaks out, a year before the United States becomes involved, but Italy is involved on the side of the Allies, of course. Isoleri is leading the Italians in the street in public demonstrations, carrying the Italian flag, and calling upon reservists to go to the consulate office in Philadelphia to indicate where they are and to make it possible for them to be returned to Italy to serve in their national army. But in his writings, he keeps contending that if it weren't for his age, he would be in the battle lines himself. This is in the World War I period. I'm not sure, but this is what he is saying, at least. This is the claim he's making, and he expresses this patriotism all through his life, to a point, in fact, that in the 1870s, an anonymous writer wrote a very hostile message to the Congregation of Propaganda Fide in Rome, and said that this person was anti-clerical. This pastor of a Catholic parish in Philadelphia is anti-clerical because he is so publicly supportive of the Italian national state. And what you have to know is that immediately after Italian independence in 1859-60 was achieved, the Pope, at the time Pius IX, issued a mandate that anyone participating in national politics would be excommunicated, which meant you could not vote in Italian politics. It wasn't just a matter of running for office, but you couldn't even vote. And here's this priest in Philadelphia who is celebrating, greeting Italian representatives arriving on calls to Philadelphia. So he gets in a lot of hot water, and there is tension between him and Wood that goes back and forth. Toward the end of Wood's tenure as the Archbishop of Philadelphia, they have reconciled, and East Hilaire is going to be treated and regarded as a rather obedient member of the clergy in Philadelphia. There's no longer a problem. Let me say something about the parish. The parish was then on Marriott Street. It is now called Montrose Street. You may know exactly where it is. It's just below Christian Street between 7th and 8th, the church. The parish, of course, spills out a little bit beyond that. It's in the heart of the old Italian area of settlement. It was the first church, as I mentioned, the oldest parish, founded in 1852. It was closed by the Archdiocese of Philadelphia as a parish in 2000. It can be opened for, I think they do the Saturday evening Mass there now, and it can be opened if your family was a member of the parish and you want to be buried from that church, or you want to have a wedding in that church. But it is absorbed as a parish by St. Paul's, a little bit further down the street on Christian Street, a territorial parish. It was the first of 23 such churches founded. 23 still within the limits of the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. There were actually more than 23, but some of them are in the Diocese of Allentown now. But in terms of the present-day boundaries of Philadelphia, it was the first of 23 founded to provide for the special needs of Italians as Catholics. That would eventually be known as nationality parishes, national or nationality parishes. And as I mentioned, there were a handful of others that are now part of the Diocese of Allentown, but 23 still in the present-day Archdiocese of Philadelphia. It was the only one in Philadelphia until the nearby Our Lady of Good Counsel was formed on Christian Street in 1898. And Good Counsel is suppressed by Doherty in 1931, I think it is. And after my talk is over, make sure you take a look at this wonderful photograph. I keep saying it's operatic. Mounted policemen, police 3 and 4 deep on the streets across from the church bell being rung all night long. They have to bring suit that goes to the State Supreme Court of Pennsylvania against the Augustinian order. It was an Augustinian church. In order to reopen the church and grant it back to the Augustinians, they were actually trying to restore the Augustinian presence as the clergy at the parish, but they had to sue the order to do it. It wasn't resolved until about 34, 35 by the Supreme Court, and I spent a chapter on it. Partly, it's a little bit of a digression in the book, but and it deserves a book of its own. But because it was such an important chapter in Philadelphia Italian Catholicism, I wanted to be the first to put it in print. And I made the argument that because it's only a block and a half away from Mary Magdalene de Pazzi, these are twinned parishes at that moment, de facto twinned parishes. But Mary Magdalene de Pazzi had also developed a reputation as being the northern Italian parish, the Genovese parish. And Good Counsel, when it was opened, was generally known as the parish for the Meridionali, the Southerners. And East Hilaire in his writings is not too comfortable with Meridionali among his population. So on the surface, in public, he's very good with them. But in terms of the things that he writes in a more subtle sort of way, a little bit more private sort of way, he raises some reservations about them. But this is the first really significant clerical companionship that he gets, and whenever Good Counsel has an event, he's always involved. He's often the principal speaker, and when his parish is having events, the pastors from Good Counsel are involved. So they seem to have had a decent enough relationship, and I am sure that by 1898, when the Italian population of Philadelphia was about 30,000, East Hilaire was very, very happy to get them. Okay. Now, people keep asking why was Good Counsel suppressed, and it's a very complicated kind of thing. And I leave it for the reader to try to figure out his or her own answer when that person reads that chapter. I don't want to. I could suggest 3 or 4 things. I haven't made up my own mind about why it was suppressed, but it was closed, and literally all hell breaks loose on the streets of Philadelphia at that point. These demonstrations, it's much like those places that you may have read about in Boston and St. Louis today, where churches that are being closed by the diocese and archdiocese are evoking this kind of resentment from the people. But street demonstrations went on for months. The pastor was barricaded in the rectory. The pastor escapes from the rectory. When he comes back the next day to get his clothes, he's threatened by the mob. People are booing him in the streets. There are bands playing patriotic Italian and American hymns in the street. It's a pretty ugly scene down there. When I first started doing research on Italians in Philadelphia and looking at church materials, the wonderful person who was the first official archivist of the Archdiocese, John DeMeo, who taught some library courses here a few years later, Father John DeMeo, said to me that he would let me look at anything he had in the archives, except, he said, please don't ask to see anything about good counsel, because there's still so much anger in Philadelphia and South Philadelphia about the closing of good counsel that nobody was too comfortable with it. Well, times have changed now, and we're all a little bit more at ease with what happened there. The old tradition has passed on. But when Good Counsel was founded, incidentally, in 1898, I said there was about 30,000 Italians in the city. In 1931, when the suppression begins, there's about 150,000 Italians. And my inclination is to suggest that Cardinal Doherty, at that point, then the Archbishop of Philadelphia, felt that the Italian population was too large to be left in the hands of the one religious order that had a very large presence in Philadelphia. That was the Augustinians. Jesuits have had a couple parishes. Other orders have been here and there. But I think the Augustinians, Roger can verify this one, I think the Augustinians have more parishes than any other religious order in Philadelphia when you start to count them, actually. If you start to count them. But there's about 10 or 12 parishes in Philadelphia that were under Augustinian control. And there was in South Philadelphia what I referred to as the Augustinian Triangle, which is Good Counsel, St. Rita's on Broad Street, which was never officially designated as an Italian church. If you look at the directories of the Archdiocese, it says English/Italian church. It always had a mixed congregation and never officially designated as a national parish. But again, de facto, it is all but an Italian national parish because of the large size of the Italian presence in the congregation. And St. Nicholas the Tolentine down at 15th and Watkins, the three corners. Okay, so Doherty closes the Augustinian flagship of that Italian presence at Good Counsel. There were other things. It was having its financial difficulties. There were scandals. I spent a bit of time in the Augustinian archives in Rome, not as much time as I wanted to. I got there late one day and worked as fast as I could while the sun was setting, and St. Peter's Square in a different light than I'd ever seen it before. Magnificent day. But there were communications going back from Philadelphia saying there's something going on between Father so-and-so and his housekeeper, and everybody in the neighborhood knows about this, and we've got to do something about this. So, I mean, there were a lot of different issues going on here, and what was the decisive thing in closing it, I think remains a little bit difficult to determine. But during these years, church leaders were having a national discussion, an international discussion, trying to find an answer to the so-called Italian problem, which was that immigrant Italians did not perform as Catholics in the way in which the Church in the United States wanted them to perform. They were not as lavish in their compensation to the Church. They came out of a country, in the case of Italy, which had been financed by the government. The Church in Italy is state-supported and had been for a long, long time now. But in the United States, congregants were being asked, parishioners were being asked to contribute large sums of money, and these are very poor people. And startup money for younger parishes, newer parishes especially, is pretty expensive. And this was a strange practice to a lot of Italians. But there was also generally a widespread belief that there was leakage, that Italians were defecting as Catholics, and some very influential writers had written about the problem of leakage, the defection of Italians in their practices as Catholics. And a lot of that perhaps has to do with the peculiar way in which Italians celebrate their Catholicism in Italy. If you've traveled in Italy, you know that church attendance might not be very large on Sundays if you go to Mass at a church. But the public devotion is a different matter. The public piety is a different matter. When it's Saint So-and-so's feast day, the whole town turns out for a very heartfelt celebration of veneration of that particular saint. And I think a lot of Catholicism in Italy is more of a private experience, a personal experience. But in the United States, this was the Italian problem. Where are they, and why aren't they giving more money? Their parishes are fragile financially, and their attendance seems to be lacking. Good Counsel is closed in the early 1930s, provoking this controversy. I'm misstating that. It's closed after it has served as a national parish in a very successful sort of way. People in South Philadelphia still grieve the closing of Our Lady of Good Counsel. They refer to it as our church, the old-timers that are still there. It was one of the most effective, I think, parishes in solving the Italian problem because it had this is one of the sodalities from Good Counsel. I have a whole bunch of pictures of that came from the Augustinian archives here on campus from Father Sheridan. When we examine the functions of the parish for an immigrant people, whether we're talking about Good Counsel or Mare Magnum de Pazzi or any of the other places, what we see is what an Italian journalist recently writing about Boston referred to as the umbilical cord. We see the connection between Italy and the New World. Okay, we see a place of connection, a place of continuity that maintained a resonance with their origins, their traditional culture, their language. There's a part of the book, I won't read it, I have enough time, I think, to do this, but which I talk about what may have rumbled through the minds of Italians as they sat in a church, that if you were to go inside of Mare Magnum de Pazzi and look around, you could easily convince yourself you're on a summer trip to Italy and you're at some church in the Abruzzo, for example. It looks like an Italian church. It looks like a church in Italy, is what I'm trying to say. And if the priest giving the sermon is speaking to you in a language that is recognizable, not precisely the same as the dialect of the region that my family came out of, but close enough, the sensory experience could be not only very familiar, but very comforting, and provide that bridge that people need when they adjust to a new life. So a place that gave them comfort and security against the hardships of a new and often very foreign, very difficult world outside of their own community in Little Italy. A place that eased their transition from Italians to Italian Americans, okay? And I try in these sections to look at how its location and its activities, looking at processions in the street and what they represent from the perspective of a folklorist, both religious and secular events that took place, usually starting in front of the church. I didn't put it up, but I have some old photographs of processions that could be saints' feast days, or they could be secular holidays in Italy that are being celebrated. But almost invariably we'll start in front of the church and then snake all through the neighborhood and come back to the church, okay? The nationality parish becomes then the device by which the church capital C, tries to preserve the faith of the Italians. But it also was the place that sustained them, of people, at a time when both nation and church wanted its foreign-born and their children to become rapidly Americanized. But it was also, I think, within the parish where Italians and their families, along with other experiences in their lives, inevitably would become Americans, okay? So we look at the parish both as an instrument of religious experience and as an instrument of assimilation to America. The people part, the third part, is perhaps the most complicated, and I'm already into that by the last remarks that I've made, so they overlap here. What I tried to deal with was how Isolari and his congregation helped bring about a cohesive community life for Italians in Philadelphia, while their experience was enabling them to become Americanized, and how what was happening fit together with what had been called the Italian problem for the church. This belief that Italians had lost their faith as Catholics as they became Americans. The contention was that Americanization is what is taking their faith away from them. There are too many Protestants in the neighborhood, too many secular threats in the neighborhood, too many things that undermine their traditional belief. So the national parish was the device that the church began to use. After a long period of dialogue, it really goes back to early councils in Baltimore in the 1840s that the idea is first broached, and then gains momentum by the late 19th century. And the plan that the church tried to use to solve this problem, to save them as Catholics by making them more American. And then to make them more American by making them more Catholic. The sequence goes in both directions, you'll see. Which actually turns out, very often, to be an attempt to make more into Irish Catholics. Okay? To make them Catholic in the way that their fellow Catholics in the territorial parishes and nearby neighborhoods were celebrating their faith as Catholics in America. With the opening of the other parishes, that long list of 23 parishes that I mentioned to you, in the early 20th century, when ground is broken, when a cornerstone is laid, when a basement chapel is dedicated, when the ground floor chapel was finally finished and dedicated, at every one of these ceremonial occasions for another community of Italians who might be in Norristown, or might be in Stratford, who might be in West Philadelphia, what they are going to hear in the dedication speeches is the school superintendent, James Flood, Irish American, reminding them of how the Irish celebrate their Catholicism. And they are hammered with this at every public moment, and they are urged to become Irish Catholics, essentially. But what is actually happening, again, is something a little bit more complicated, and we see their struggle, not just of Italians, but I think any ethnic group, to adjust to others, to other ethnic groups, and to the mainstream in American life as components of a very complicated American Catholic population, to find their faith and retain their faith within the context of American Catholicism. I would prefer to think that my book is not simply about Italians, but really about any ethnic group. Some people will read it and see the experience of Latino Catholics today in it, or some people will link it to the struggles of German Catholics in the middle of the 19th century, as the German communities in the frontier cities of Milwaukee and St. Louis are bourgeoning with large German populations. It's also not just about religion, but it's about the secular experience of becoming American, and I've said enough about that. And it clearly represents, I think, an extension of what I began in the previous book, Building Little Italy, where I devoted about 6 pages to this experience and realized that I had this huge pile of material and 6 pages wasn't going to do it. There was much more to deal with, and this thing opened up. Let me make a final note in closing. When I make presentations such as this one, I like to include some kind of personal remarks on why I chose to write this kind of book rather than spend my time on other matters that are important to me, other professional matters, academic matters that are important to me. A lot of it has to do with the response that I received to the previous book. After one public presentation, feeling very good that I had accomplished this book, somebody came up to me and said, "When are you going to do another one?" I thought, good Lord, let me bask a little bit in the comfort and glory of having achieved something that was very important to me. But I thought about what he said, and I realized that there was an appetite on the part of a reading public that wasn't being filled, especially Italian Americans who wanted to know more about their own history. And I never really erased that guy's question from my mind. I also had a whole series of very comforting, very affirming experiences. The editor of the only daily Italian language newspaper in the United States, America Oggi, writing a very flattering review that was almost the entire back page of the issue when the first book came out. In a big headline over the article, referred to my book as un atto d'amore, act of love. And more than anything else he wrote in the review, I thought the review, he really understood what I was up to, what I was trying to express, but I loved the way that he captured it. Another person at a bookstore out in King of Prussia who came up to me after I'd made a presentation and told me about a father dying of cancer who had become very silent to his family until she started reading him pages from my book and about the old neighborhood. And he started talking to his family again, and that really chokes me up. And I thought, wow, there isn't anything nicer to hear than that. I mean, I was really blown away. And then a black writer, writing in a black newspaper in Philadelphia, who wrote in his review of my book that it should be on the shelf alongside of W.E.B. Du Bois's Philadelphia Negro. And I thought for black journalists to say that again, I thought maybe I'd done something more than I ever realized. And then more recently, a gentleman who lives in a small town in Italy who sent me an email, a town where some of the first Italians to settle and form a community in Philadelphia came from, the people that I wrote about in the previous book, who sent me an email within the last year sometime thanking me for having written a new book about Isolari and his church. And I thought, gee, the word is getting out, and this kind of compliment I especially cherish. And then there's a negative side of all of that. There is the widespread popularity for programs like The Sopranos, which I won't watch, never watched. I've read scripts, and that's enough. And I believe, along with Father Andrew Greeley and the late Mary McGrory, that it's not artistically an especially good program, despite what the flacks for the industry say about it. I've found other people who have said, no, not really. But I don't like what it does in terms of projecting an image of the Italian experience for consumption by Italian Americans as well as other kinds of Americans. Or during the spring, the National Geographic this spring announced a documentary, yet another documentary on something we desperately need, on the Philly mob. Yet another documentary on the Philly mob. This is all there is to Italian American experience? Well, some people see it differently. You have public broadcast television programs on South Philadelphia and other places that suggest that nostalgia in the form of tomato sauce recipes, street corner singers, and opera buffo depictions of neighborhood life, that's Italian American history. And I think that's a half a notch below The Sopranos in my eyes, because I do not think heritage and history are the same, and I do not think that this romantic celebration of nostalgia is the same as good scholarly history. I think there's something more to the Italian American experience than all of that, that Italian Americans have a history that deserves to be told. And thinking of the remarks that I opened this presentation with about the various groups that make up the history of a large city or a larger population. I might also add here that shortly after the first book, the previous book came out, Building Little Italy, someone called the bookstore at the Visitor Center at Independence Hall Park and asked if they had it. And the answer was that they really only sold stacked books there on early American history. And the caller told me that he then said that, well, this book is documenting and describing the lives of Italians who are actually here living and working in Philadelphia since before the American Revolutionary War. And the Visitor Center clerk at the bookstore said that could not be because there weren't any here. So when I hear that kind of thing, I hear a voice screaming that there is a need to balance the books and fill the gap and it hadn't been done. I might also say, really at the end here, that do have a third book underway, which hopefully, if I'm spared to live long enough, it will deal with later events in Italian experience in Philadelphia, dealing more with politics, with community formation in the later time, with Americanization, with particularly how the immigrant community was organized and controlled, as well as how it was perceived both by its own indigenous members and observers outside of it, as well as how it is conceived by scholars who study immigrant life. I hope that I've accomplished something by the work that I've already done. I hope that I've left something that is of value for Italian Americans about their missing history, but also for other kinds of people who want to learn something about Italian Americans that goes beyond The Sopranos or goes beyond the family arguing around the kitchen table on that PBS documentary kind of thing about how to make the tomato sauce. But I would also say that whatever I've been able to do, it still represents only the beginning of what needs to be done. And the words of T.S. Eliot that I began with can now be completed, because the next lines of that famous piece of poetry read, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time."